Gary Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949. He is an American serial killer known as the Green River Killer. He was initially convicted of 48 separate murders and later confessed to nearly twice that number. He murdered numerous women and girls in Washington State and California during the 1980s and the 1990s. Most of his victims were alleged to be prostitutes. When the press gave him his nickname after the first 5 victims were found in the Green River, his identity was not known. He strangled the women, usually by hand but sometimes using ligatures. After strangling them, he would dump their bodies throughout forested and overgrown area in King County, often returning to the dead bodies to have sexual intercourse with them. On November 30th, 2001, he was arrested for the murders of 4 women whose cases were linked to him through DNA evidence. To avoid the death penalty, he then agreed to disclose the location of other missing females. He is currently in prison. Dennis Andrew Nilsen, born on the 23rd of November, 1945, is a British serial killer and necrophiliac, also known as the Muswell Hill Murderer and the Kindley Killer, who committed the murders of a minimum of 12 young men in a series of killings committed between 1978 and 83. All of Nilsen's murders were committed at 2 addresses in which he alternately resided throughout the year. They would be lured to these addresses through guile and were all murdered by strangulation, sometimes accompanied by drowning. Following the murder, Nilsen would observe a ritual in which he bathed and dressed the victims' bodies, which he would retain for extended periods of time, before dissecting and disposing of the remains via burning upon a bonfire or flushing the remains down a laboratory. He was in the Army for 9 years. While stationed at Aldershot, Nilsen's latent homosexual feelings began to stir, but didn't want anyone to know for the fear of being judged. Dennis Nilsen was brought to trial on the 24th of October, 1983, charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. The judge sentenced Nilsen to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years imprisonment.
Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. The son of an alcoholic father and an incredibly religious mother, Gein grew up alongside his older brother Henry in a household ruled by his mother's preachings about the sins and the lust and carnal desire. Ed Gein was obsessively devoted to his mother up until her death in 1945. He never left home or dated women. After she died, he became increasingly deranged and eventually began prowling cemeteries to unearth recently buried female corpses. He would cut off body parts and keep them as trophies, returning the corpses seemingly undisturbed to their graves. In 1954, Ed Gein turned from grave robbing to murder, a task he was less meticulous about. Police implicated him in the murders of 2 women in 1957. During the investigation, police learned that he had practiced necrophilia and experimented with human taxidermy. Gein was ultimately found guilty of murder by reason of insanity. He was confined in various criminal psychiatric institutions, including the Central State Hospital in Wisconsin and the Mendota Mental Health Institution, where he died of respiratory and heart failure due to cancer on July 26, 1984, at age 77. His killings live on as the infamous inspiration for such film characters as Norman Bates from the movie Psycho, James Gumb, Silence of the Lambs, and Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
John Wayne Gacy, known as the Killer Clown, also called Pogo, was an American serial killer and rapist who was convicted of the sexual assault and murder of at least 33 teenage boys and young men. The killings took place between 1972 and 1978. All of his murders were committed in Norwood Park Township. His victims were either lured or taken by force. All his murders were committed by either strangulation and asphyxiation, except for his first victim that was stabbed to death. 26 of the people murdered were found in his crawl space. 4 of them were thrown in the Des Plaines River, and the other 3 were buried in unknown places in his yard. Gary was executed 14 years after being put on death row through lethal injection.
Notorious serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on May 21, 1960, into the loving household of Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. He wanted nothing in his former years and was a happy child until the age of 6, when a minor surgery to correct a double hernia seemed to effect a change on the boy. Following Dahmer's surgery, which coincided with the birth of his brother, he became increasingly insular and lacking in self-confidence. Dahmer claims that his compulsions to necrophilia and murder began at the age of 14, but it appears that the breakdown of his parents' marriage and their divorce led to psychological stresses associated and may have been the catalyst for turning these earlier thoughts into actions. Just after he graduated from high school in June 1978, Dahmer picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks and took him home to his parents' house, where they drank beer and had sex. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer killed him with a blow to the head with a barbell. He dismembered the corpse of his first victim, packed the body parts in plastic bags, and buried them in the woods behind his parents' house. It would be another 9 years before he encountered his second victim. In January 1979, after only 1 term at the Ohio State University, Dahmer dropped out of school due to his drinking problem. His recently remarried father insisted that he enlist in the army, and Dahmer was posted to Germany. And 2 years later, he was discharged from the army due to his raging alcoholic problem. When he returned home after the discharge, he uncovered Hicks's remains, pulverized them with a hammer, and scattered the pieces even more widely throughout the woods. An arrest in October 1981 for disorderly conduct prompted his father to send Dahmer to live with his grandmother in Wisconsin, but the alcohol problems persisted. His next arrest occurred years later in September 1986. Dahmer was arrested for masturbating in front of 2 young boys and received a 1-year probationary sentence. In September 1987, Dahmer took his second victim, Stephen Toomey, whom he met in a gay bar. They checked into a hotel room and drank heavily, and the following morning, Toomey was dead. Dahmer claims to have found Toomey dead beside him when he awoke. He brought a large suitcase to transport the body to his grandmother's basement, where he had sex and masturbated on the corpse, before dismembering it and disposing the remains in the garbage. Dahmer's killing spree lasted for 13 years. He sought only African-American men at gay meeting places, lured them home to his grandmother's basement with the promises of money or sex, where he would feed them alcohol laced with drugs before strangling them to death. Then he would usually have sex with the corpses and keep their genitals or skulls as souvenirs. He often photographed his victims throughout the various stages to relive the experience over and over. Tired of Dahmer's drunken nights, she eventually kicked him out in September 1988, but not before he had killed another 2 victims. Around the same time, Dahmer had an extremely lucky escape. An encounter with a 13-year-old boy resulted in charges of sexual exploitation and second-degree sexual assault for Dahmer. He pleaded guilty, claiming that the boy had appeared much older. While awaiting sentencing for his sexual assault case, Dahmer temporarily moved back in with his grandmother, again putting her basement into gruesome use. In February 1989, he lured, drugged, strangled, photographed, dismembered, and disposed of Anthony Sears, a young African-American man. At the end of the trial, Dahmer ended up only with 1-year prison sentence with work release in the daytime and 5 years of probation. Over the 15 months that followed, up to the time of his capture, Dahmer's victim count accelerated. 12 more lives were taken. Necrophilia is generally associated with issues of exercising control over victims. Dahmer developed these rituals as he progressed. experimenting with chemical means of disposal, and he also consumed the flesh of his victims. He attempted to create real-life zombies, drilling into victims' skulls while they were still alive, injecting them with muriatic acid to see whether he could extend his control over the living. Most of these victims died instantly, but he claimed that one victim had survived for a number of days in a zombie-like state with limited motor function. He was careful to select victims on the fringes of society who were often borderline criminal, making their disappearances less noticeable and his likelihood of capture that much less. On May 26, 1991, Dahmer's African-American neighbor, Sandra Smith, called the police to report that a young Asian boy was running naked in the street. When the police arrived, the boy was incoherent, and they accepted the word of Dahmer, a white man in a largely poor African-American community, that the boy was his 19-year-old lover who had too much to drink. Over the protests of Smith and her daughter, who could clearly see that the boy was terrified of Dahmer, the police escorted Dahmer and the boy home, and clearly not wishing to become involved in a homosexual domestic disturbance, took a look around before leaving. Once the police left the scene, Dahmer strangled the boy and proceeded with his usual rituals. They had conducted even a basic search. Police officers would have found the body of Dahmer's 12th victim decomposing in the bedroom, and enough photographic evidence to immediately arrest the serial killer. Dahmer's luck finally ran out on July 22, 1991, when two Milwaukee police officers picked up Tracy Edwards, a young African-American man who was wandering the streets with a handcuff dangling from his wrist. They decided to investigate the man's claims that a weird dude had drugged and restrained him, and arrived at Dahmer's apartment, where he calmly offered to get the keys for the handcuffs. Edwards claimed that the knife Dahmer had threatened him with was in the bedroom, and when the officers went to corroborate the story, he noticed photographs of dismembered bodies lying around, which included one of a head in the fridge. He shouted to his colleague to restrain Dahmer, who fought back fiercely, but was nevertheless subdued. A search revealed a head in the fridge as well as 3 more in the freezer, and a catalog of other horrors, including preserved skulls, jars containing genitalia, and an extensive gallery of gruesome photographs. Despite having confessed to the killings during police interrogation, Dahmer initially pleaded not guilty to all the charges. However, against the advice of his legal counsel, he changed his plea to guilty by virtue of insanity. But the jury chose to believe that the prosecutor's assertion that Dahmer was fully aware that his acts were evil, but that he chose to commit them anyway, returning after only 5 hours deliberation to find him guilty, but sane, on all counts on February 17, 1992. Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, or 957 years in prison. Dahmer apparently adjusted well to prison life, but he was mostly kept away from other inmates for his own protection. He found religion in the form of books and photos sent to him by his father, and he was granted permission by the Columbia Correctional Institution to be baptized by a local preacher. On November 28, 1994, he was assigned to work with 2 other prisoners, one of whom was a white supremacist murderer, Jesse Anderson, and the other a delusional schizophrenic African-American murderer, Christopher Scarver. 20 minutes after they had been left alone to complete their tasks, guards returned to find that Scarver had crushed Dahmer's skull and fatally beaten Anderson with a blunt object. Stories conflict as to whether the weapon was a broom handle or a weight bar from the prison gym.